The officers of the British Army, a generation of young men flushed with arrogance, born out of wealth and privilege. A group of hapless, feckless, useless boys and old men rolling in port, gout, and 13 chins. These are caricatures handed to us by, funnily enough, caricatures, with those absurdities and those embellishments having become embedded in popular perception. But what's the reality of the men who led Wellington's army to victory? Were they really a crop of useless men who needed to be weeded out by the Duke of York's reforms? Where in society were they really drawn from? And how was it that the British Army was able to succeed in a world where there was no official system of checking and training these men for the roles that they would fulfill? Tonight, we return to look at the life of the officers of the British Army, exploring their origins, their training, their flaws, and their successes. This is the British Officers, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are returning to our examination of the British Army in what is now part something like 27 out of 3,472. Ordinarily, we would be joined by Dr. Kevin Linch, but I regret to say that we cannot be joined by Dr. Kevin Linch anymore ever again, for a very simple reason. Dr. Linch does not exist. He's been replaced by Professor Kevin Linch from the University of Leeds, and we are very excited by this frankly long overdue promotion. If you haven't heard of Kevin's work already, then frankly, I don't know what rock you've been hiding under. Please go back and listen to the back catalogue. He specializes in the history of Britain in the 18th and early 19th century, focusing on the history of Britain's armed forces and their relationship to the wider political, social, and cultural trends. He's the author of the recently published The British Army 1783 to 1815 and Britain and Wellington's Army. And working with Dr. Simon Quinn, he recently launched that fantastic online database of British Army officers that is available at georgianarmyofficers.org. Kevin, welcome back, Professor Kevin. Do we call you Professor Kevin or Professor Lynch? Which do you prefer?
Can. I don't mind. As long as the professor's in there.
Okay.
Thank you for that introduction. That's made me smile.
Not at all. And joining me as ever in the co-pilot seat for this British Army extravaganza, the quartermaster, the most estimable of firefighters, I've forgotten, what is it? Red coat in residence? Is that what your T-shirt says now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, there we go. Liam Telfer joins me once again in the inverted commas studio. Hello, mate. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And a big congratulations to Professor Kevin.
Thank
Really
you.
pleased to be back. And I would also like to just quickly plug that Kevin and the podcast have sort of hammered out an exclusive deal to continue this series. And we've got lots of exciting episodes coming up. We're going to be doing some pieces on the rank and file careers, how the army was paid and fed, combat and its structure, a Duke of York special at some point. Lots of very, very exciting things to come in this series as we get through the year. Yeah, I'm just absolutely chuffed to bits that we've got that wrapped up, and looking forward to another really good episode.
So let's dive in. We're not going to hang about. Last time round, we covered the background of these men, the processes that they got into the army, the training, which was kind of sporadic, haphazard, poor in many cases, and how much they were kind of involved in the things like regimental administration, core duties on the battlefield. And we finished by touching on the purchase system.
Mm.
And we're going to carry on where we left off by looking at the forms of advancement that are open to officers. Now, I'm not going to go back over the purchase system. Listeners, stop being lazy. Go back and listen to the previous episode. Like, there's a reason that we do these in a sequence. But what I would like to look at now is things like patronage. You know, how valuable is that as a medium? The different levels of patronage, kind of perhaps more casualized elements versus the you're very much in somebody's pocket. You are perhaps known to be somebody's inverted commas man, and the benefits and disadvantages of that if that person falls out of favor. And the issues, I guess, with competency that this then generates, because this has inevitably implications for men on the battlefield. It also has implications in something like the more technical services, like the artillery and the engineers. And equally, I guess, if you want to get ahead, does being brave in battle, is it the most efficient way necessarily of climbing your way up a very greasy pole?
Mm. There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? For a first question. The patronage question is obviously really interesting, and that's why you've asked it. Kind of when you look at it externally, officially, the army is run on either through the purchase system or a system of strict seniority. So it looks like there isn't a patronage system. It's kind of if you're the highest ranking lieutenant and a vacancy occurs in the captains in your unit, then you move into that role. And so it looks like that everyone just sort of shuffles up the ladder kind of almost automatically without any involvement from any patrons, any commanding officers or anything like that. And quite a lot of the promotions are like that. You do just see people just, working their way through the ranks through just long service. But perhaps they're the ones who don't have patronage or no one with particular influence, I think. Where patronage can come in, and this is particularly someone like the Duke of York, who it's read and there's rumours that he had lists of officers that he was kind of looking out for, but I've not found them. But I don't doubt that they were there somewhere, or certainly the military secretary, the kind of person who dealt with a lot of the personnel, so if you like, of the army, knew about people. They would find vacancies for officers that they wanted to promote. So they might be the perhaps the fifth or sixth ranked lieutenant in a particular unit, but their date of commission, and this is really important about the date of commission to that rank, what could mean if they moved to another unit, they were allowed to supersede all the other lieutenants. So if someone had a control of or a knowledge of where all the officers were in a particular unit, they could move people around the army into different units to get them kind of promoted when they want to do them. And that is something that you do sort of, some movements look suspicious. Sometimes I think is the best way of putting it. And that's where the database that we did with Simon Quinn is starting to show some of these up. So the Duke of York's patronage was really important, I think, if you sort of came to his attention, because he was colonel-in-chief, not only commander-in-chief, but also colonel of several regiments. So he could know all the information about where officers were in that unit and can move people in and out of them quite easily because he was their colonel and the commander-in-chief. And that's why, for those those of us who've looked closely at it, and if you ever go and investigate kind of some officers, sometimes you'll find them moving very quickly in and out of some units, particularly like the 60th Regiment of Foot, where there's 5 battalions, there's lots of officers. Someone comes in and they've only been there for a few months, and they obviously didn't actually serve with the 60th Regiment of Foot, but it gains them that rank, gives them a next step, and then they can move sometimes even back to the regiment that they were in before. They suddenly reappear, having being sort of mid-table, if you like, lieutenant, and then they come back as a captain, and they've superseded all the other lieutenants in their unit because the kind of high command, if you like, the Duke of York has manipulated the system to their advantage. So that kind of being in particularly the Duke of York's eye, I think, was really important. I think how he knew about them is an interesting question because there's a lot, and we come back to about the sort of the competency and battle. I think also other commanders could, more distant from London, could do some work like that as well. Particularly the Duke of Wellington could shuffle officers around a bit or make recommendations for moving officers. those particularly, I suppose, like the commander in chief in India. It's a long way from London. Again, if he wants to kind of, make some temporary moves around that then get confirmed about a year later when the paperwork actually turns up in London, then they can do that. So yeah, there is an important part to play in patronage, I think, in accelerating some people's careers within the sort of strict, what appears to be very strict regimental structure of the army. The other way that the army could do this, I mean, this is turning into a very long answer to a very long question, so it's fine. Once they got to a captain level, was to promote people with brevet ranks, which meant giving them a rank in the army, which was separate from their regimental rank. So they could promote a captain to be a major, and any commander in a particular theatre could make that recommendation to do that. And they were often given to either people that they wanted to be staff officers, so the kind of brigade majors, the kind of sort of staff from a brigade upwards, they would start picking out officers for that, or sometimes kind of as rewards for particular notable events on battlefields. And in some cases, it was just blanket awards. So I think everyone who was above captain of the Battle of Waterloo got a promotion, a brevet promotion. And I think when the Prince Regent gained all his powers as Prince Regent, he decided that was the moment to promote every officer who had been a captain of so many years' service to be a major. So there's an enormous, great long list in the London Gazette for that month. So that was kind of, two ways that they can fiddle the system, if you like, to get people where they want them. You mentioned about disadvantages, and that's an interesting one. I'm trying to think of where someone else fell with, if you like, another higher ranking officer who fell out of favour. I'm kind of struggling a bit there, actually. It's not to say it didn't happen, but yeah, that's well, that's something that's a question for the database, isn't it? You've given me a research question of right, okay, whose careers was kind of sort of rocketing along and then suddenly stops. That perhaps it's linked to other influences of they're falling out of favour. You mentioned the artillery and engineers, and just to go, emphasise them being a little bit more different. The patronage system there is much harder to manipulate, and there is very strict seniority, promotion by seniority in those units. So progression for officers in those is incredibly slow because they are almost always waiting basically for someone else to die and they're filling their shoes. Sometimes they could manipulate it a bit with brevet ranks again, and sometimes in different armies as well. I think Wellington did it with the artillery commander that he wanted, actually promoted him in the Portuguese army up to lieutenant colonel, which then made he could outrank all the other sort of more senior artillery officers that were there. That was quite a neat sleight of hand, I think, on his part to do that. But that was very unusual, I think, for him to be able to do that. Yeah. Did I answer all of that?
You absolutely did. So we have a new system on this show where we're only allowed 2 rabbit holes
You're going to use one now.
Per host, per interview. And so I want to use about 3 already. Which this is the look I'm getting from Liam. Don't you effing dare is a good summary of it. In terms of that thing with patronage, I guess I was kind of influenced by thinking about what happens to Popham, albeit in a naval context, and kind of how that leads to big challenges. Although, frankly, in some respects, Popham is arguably an architect of his own demise as well. But my actual rabbit hole is, this is deeply unfair because this is something that I stumbled across the other day, and I'm just really interested in whether or not you've seen an equivalence. And this is in relation to Wellington talking about a couple of mixed race officers who end up literally, just as far as he's concerned, appearing out in India. And he writes a couple of letters about this. It happens in October 1801. Their names are Lieutenant Hook and Lieutenant Stewart, and I read that into the record partly because folks might be interested, and partly
Yeah.
because you might actually want to go and look them up at some point. And they go out to join the 33rd. And Wellington sort of writing these letters to a few people, kind of going, hang on a minute, has anybody okayed this? And he sort of goes, well, I don't understand that Cornwallis has okayed this. And I don't think they went to the War Office. And I don't think the Commander in Chief was responsible. And therefore, I don't think they've been checked. And I don't think somebody's kind of thought about the optics of this. Optics being Wellington's concerned about mixed race officers
Yeah.
blurring the visual distinction between the white officer class and the sepoys. And then in a second letter, and I'm just going to quote this, he's writing to Lieutenant Colonel Shee, and he says, without having any prejudice against half-caste men, who, I dare say, may be intrinsically as good as others, I have strong objection to a blackface in a European corps in this country, and I think that if these gentry are of the colour that I hear they are, it is not proper that they should be allowed to remain in the 33rd Regiment. So my question is, do we have any other instances that you've come across yet of guys who we understand to be mixed race having their careers stymied because of their ethnicity?
Short answer is that no, I haven't come across that. I wouldn't be surprised if I found it. If I looked hard and I could think about where I would look hard for that. And one of this is where some of the limitations about the information we have are problematic. One area would be the regiments that were the kind of temporary units that were raised in the Caribbean in the 1790s, from all kind of parts of the kind of Caribbean community. So not just enslaved Africans, but also mixed race communities there. And them being then moved into what becomes the West India regiments, whether there would have been a moment there where they went through and decided actually we don't want some of these officers because of their race. But we have limited information about some of these temporary units, unfortunately, precisely because they were temporary, but also I think probably because they didn't want too much attention about some of them, I think, because of some of those issues. So no, I haven't come across anything explicitly like that. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if there are other incidents there that could be looked into, particularly moments where it's likely that those sorts of circumstances would have happened again, in other contexts. Otherwise, yeah, the officer corps is very exclusively white, as I think we talked about before, and so someone is kind of policing that.
Kevin, I'm not gonna play my rabbit hole hand too soon. I think it would be amazing to it'd be really interesting to deep dive into the Duke of York's patronage and those regiments he was the colonel of, and those movements. But I'll save that for later. Looking at I want to look at the divide of sorts. It's probably quite a philosophical question in some ways. There's clearly a divide between those in the rank and file and commissioned officers. And what I would like to look at is what the biggest elements of that divide are. And is it as simple as education and financial means, or is there more to it than that?
Partly, actually, the answer is it was a very specific divide in the actual army itself, in terms of the way they organized themselves socially. They were expected to be separate. The officers were not in the barracks with the enlisted men and these sorts of things. And when you see all the plans for buildings like that, and even kind of camps as well, when they set up kind of temporary camps and tents and these sorts of things, it's kind of encoded in those spaces that they are separated, I think. So there's an expectation from the army that they will be. For most officers, I think, and enlisted men, there is this gap, which is going to be kind of financial and educational. The officers have to be able to read and write. How competent some of them were at actually doing it is a different matter, but they should have had that level of education. There is a financial commitment too as being an officer. There is, though, a kind of, as with all these things, there's going to be a grey area somewhere along there, which are those NCOs that can read and write and perhaps are not, from the working poor, if you like, who join the army out of perhaps desperation sometimes, who have some financial means or some influence, some friends, and they do become officers, some of them. Yeah, some of them get kind of field promotions, some of them get promoted for long service, and so they do bridge that divide between the officers and men. But I think once they step into that world, the ones that are at least seen as successful by the officer corps or the other officers of their unit are the ones who sort of make that break from their previous existence, rather than kind of sort of sitting, somewhere in between and being, friends with both officers and men and these sorts of things. So there is certain expectations about behaviour changing. That will be the kind of, if you like, the case for most of the time. I think when officers and enlisted men get on campaigns, then things will start going to change, particularly the junior officers, so the ensigns and second lieutenants and the lieutenants. Their role in leading a small group of men and looking after a small group of men, I think when they end up on campaigns means that sometimes those boundaries are getting a bit blurred. And certainly some of the kind of research that's been done on junior officers has highlighted they, had the same hardships as the enlisted men. All right, they may have had some financial backing back home in Britain or Ireland, but that might not actually be much help if they're in the middle of somewhere in Spain or Portugal with no access to kind of any kind of banking system, and basically they haven't got any coins, no cash. They'd still be scrabbling around to kind of make ends meet themselves as well. So they're at moments I think it wouldn't be quite as sharp, that divide, I think, but institutionally I think they were expected to have quite a sharp divide between the two.
Yeah, I think that's a great point on campaign. It doesn't matter how much money you've got in the bank. If there's nothing, if you don't have the means to buy it, and also if there's nothing to buy, if there is nothing available, then that divide is going to become a lot closer. Just to follow that up slightly, I wondered if there are any examples of the divide existing on maybe different levels between different regiments, perhaps. The Foot Guards are a great example, perhaps, or the sexier cavalry regiments, in comparison to line regiments or garrison regiments and things like that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. I think the divide in the Guards regiments would be much sharper, mainly because the expectations about being a Guards officer on their sort of social and financial commitment to being an officer was that much higher. Some of the list of things they're expected to take it seems crazy. They're expected to host dinners for the other officers in their regiment sometimes. So there's kind of a level there which is just, right, this is a completely different world. I think there probably were also regiments, and certainly where they were fighting in smaller detachments, where it would be the other end of the scale, where the officers wouldn't be quite so distant just because they were operating in smaller groups. So some of the light infantry units, I think, would fall into that kind of category, particularly where they're operating as kind of companies or small detachments that are attached to a brigade or something. So the 5th Battalion, the 60th would be one, and the 95th a bit as well. But also it'd be the same thing, I think, in some garrisons, some places that, if you and kind of 30 or 40 men put in garrison duty somewhere, I think that the relationships there are going to be a little bit different. So some of those would be about place and where they are and circumstances, but I think some regiments did have some different ethoses as well. A lot could depend on the commanding officer of that unit, or the officer commanding, which is slightly different, and what they thought officers should be like with their men. Some might kind of feel that they should be very exclusive and very separate from them, and others may feel at certain times they need to be with their men and checking them and looking after them, because that was an important part of managing the regiment. Managing that unit was personnel management, and checking on things. Yeah, so there are definitely differences.
Okay, so lots to unpack there. Let's shift focus a little bit and start thinking about pastimes that officers are engaged on. These can be quite diverse, I tend to find, in by looking at the memoirs. You've got some guys who are like really into things like watercolor painting. You've got other guys who are using their travels out in Spain and Portugal to go sightseeing, and they sort of do
Yeah.
these long, sort of flowery, waffly. I mean, imagine that, somebody being flowery and waffly in relation to the Napoleonic Wars. It could inspire somebody to start a podcast. And they're talking about the scenes that they're seeing in the hills and all the rest of like
Yeah.
all of that. Other times, people are getting drunk. Like there seem to be a lot of things that people want to do. I suppose some of that is
Mm.
influenced by what we were just talking about in terms of money. But just
Mm.
talk us through, I guess, first of all, how much time off these guys have, because that's probably a
Mm.
perception that people have. Oh, these guys are sitting around doing nothing, and it's the sergeant majors who do all the work.
Mm.
It sounds a little bit like this podcast. He says, looking at Liam. And also kind of talk us through the financial aspect of this.
The how much time one's an interesting one. It's difficult to judge sometimes because of exactly the things that get written about in the, it kind of looks like they're spending an enormous amount of time kind of doing these kind of their individual pursuits. But of course, they're not writing about the day-to-day stuff that they have to do. Um, but they obviously did have leisure time. I think that's one of the things that's obvious. And certainly at moments even on campaigns, there would be down times, I think, where the army is kind of more settled and there's more opportunity for doing these things. But it could be the other extremes where they're, on major advances or in approaches to battle and big retreats as well, where there is no time for this sort of stuff. Garrisons, I think, would be much more kind of settled. And yeah, officers there, I think, I suppose we don't know yet about whether some officers got picked on to do all the duties because they were competent and the others, some just got kind of left alone. The expectation was that it'd be a kind of sort of rotation through all the different jobs in a garrison. You had to be an officer with a day and this sort of stuff would go around and check on all the men and, each officer would take turns to do this. How far that actually happened is, again, we don't have time and motion studies of the officer corps from the early 19th centuries to answer that. But yeah, they had time to do these things, I think. I suppose way of lumping them all together, and it is lumping them all together, is they're kind of considered gentlemanly pursuits. This is what you're expected to do as a gentleman, whether it is, tourism or it is kind of painting and sketching and these sorts of things, or reading is the other thing, or it is basically going hunting or getting drunk or gambling. All of these would fit recognizably into this is what gentlemen do back in Britain and Ireland, with various levels of kind of approval or disapproval of those kind of behaviors, but they were sort of seen as these were not necessarily acceptable but kind of recognizable as gentlemanly. And I shouldn't forget actually on that list as well about womanizing as well too. That was certainly kind of one aspect of what some officers and some gentlemen thought they should be doing. That does require, and it's not just the Mormonising part, all of those things require money and resources to do. Some of them to a lesser extent than others. So yeah, not everyone can go hunting and have a pack of hounds with them on campaign. Some do. They can kind of try and do that. The other sort of pursuits were less financially demanding. So the sketching and the watercolor is a really interesting one because of that. Okay, there's some investment in that material to be able to do these things, but it's not the same as an endless round of sort of social activities and hosting dinners and these sorts of things for people. So like many things with the officers, I think people could perhaps fit their financial kind of status and clout for these particular activities, provided they fitted within that model of gentlemanly behavior or gentlemanly misbehavior, I think would probably be the other way of putting it, as well. And that meant that these sorts of things were kind of okay. An interesting one, I'm now just thinking about it. Now you've got me thinking about it, is they don't talk much about sports, apart from kind of hunting, which is something that does change later on. in the army, but there isn't kind of any sort of reference to any kind of, athletic or kind of sporting kind of pursuits. Maybe that was seen as a bit kind of lower class, not gentlemanly in this period, yeah.
Kevin, I was kind of you've almost preempted my first rabbit hole a little bit there, and I wonder if you've got any examples of officers enjoying kind of R&R time with their men, particularly company officers, for example. And one of the points I was gonna mention actually was sports and things like that, intercompany competitions, and we know these sorts of things happened quite broadly, but I wonder if you could shed a bit more light on that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, as I say, I was just talking about, I struggle to think of kind of specific examples where it happened. And if there are sort of competitions, um, sometimes it relates to military activity, so shooting being one of them, and having shooting competitions, and that's sometimes where the officers and the men could kind of, engage together, I think. But again, it would kind of focus on regiments that perhaps were emphasizing skill in marksmanship, and these sorts of things. Otherwise, though, yeah, I struggle to kind of think of sort of specific examples, but you kind of know it's coming, if you like, which is the interesting thing, that this does become a really big thing in the British Army. So there's a moment about when does this start happening, and about why that is. And certainly you can understand why it wouldn't happen on campaigns and these sorts of things. But then a lot of the army is kind of in garrisons and is quite fixed, and sometimes has quite a lot of time on its hands. But yeah, I can't think of that much evidence of those sorts of things that you talked about. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about an aspect that there is perhaps a little more evidence of, albeit I think perceptions are a bit skewed by the famous examples. At this point, Joanna Smith enters the chat because we're about to consider officers' wives who are really important to this story. The folks might be listening to this going, "Oh, but there aren't very many of them." Well, let's ask the expert about that because I have some suspicions. Let's start, I guess, with the regulations and the norms about officers taking their wives on campaign, bearing in mind that for the rank and file, it's take lots and 6 are allowed to go. Do we have evidence? Well, we do, I guess, of officers taking their wives. Is that frowned upon? Is that something that's seen as really quite iffy because it's a conflict zone, or aren't they sort of really sort of thinking in terms of, oh, what could happen if? And equally, the experiences of these wives. What do we know about how they deal with them and process everything that they see around them? Because it's not as though, well, in some cases, actually, that's not true. Perhaps some of them, spend time back in Lisbon and don't see the horrors of campaign. But those who really do stay with the army, or those who follow even moderately closely behind the army's line of advance, will see the fallout of what's happening at the front.
Yeah, on the regulations and kind of sort of official attitudes, yeah, there wasn't the same kind of structure that there was for the wives of the enlisted men, where it was, you're allowed 6 per company, and kind of you take your chance and take a lot to see who actually turns up. But I think there was a recognition, particularly in kind of campaigning environments, that this was women on campaign with them would add to the sort of the size of the army and some of the complications of moving it. It's just more people around, and that's besides the point about actually the emotional kind of attachments that officers may have to obviously their wives, and them being there as well, and thinking about what the army would be thinking about. Well, yeah, what's that going to do to an officer if they're worried about where their wife is going to be staying tonight, and these sorts of things, and all those complications. So I think there's a sense that they would want to try and limit it, but kind of official regulations on this were not that clear on it. Yeah, the numbers. it's not the sort of thing that the army wanted to record. So we're kind of left with bits about the anecdotes, really. And like you said, I think there is sort of different levels to this. So there are the women and wives who are right with the officers throughout most of their campaigning lives, not most of their service. Those that perhaps sort of just away from the front line, and then those who would want to get as close as they could, but that might mean the kind of major, depot town of that campaign. You mentioned Lisbon being, a good example, and probably later on in the war, it moves to other areas like Madrid. Um, and then there's the kind of other tier, which is probably the majority, which were those that were still back in Britain and Ireland, and Severine Angier's work showing how much they were writing to each other. So even though they weren't physically kind of in contact, doesn't mean that they, were completely separated. So there are all these kind of different, spatial dimensions to it about wives. I think one thing that perhaps the army did recognise, and the officers certainly did, was the role that they played just beyond being obviously a wife, but potentially as kind of nurses for wounded officers, and a repose, R&R, these sorts of things, which was really important to recuperating officers, I think. And I can't think of any particular examples off the top of my head, but actually knowing that some wives would move to be closer to their officers and their officer husband in those sort of circumstances too. The kind of category within this is actually obviously the women that officers meet when they're out campaigning that they then marry as well. So some sort of pre-existing relationships, before they go campaigning, before they even join the army, and others are actually formed as part of military service. The experiences of women. We have some kind of written things on this, and much like the officers, I think, and all the men, it's kind of going to be pretty varied, and we're in the hands of what they decided they want to write about, and who they thought they were writing for, and what models of feminine care or kind of female role they were thought they should be portraying within those kind of documents. So certainly the kind of dutiful wife and caring for the husband comes out in those sorts of stories. Some of them things you think they probably did see things that they didn't talk very much about. And certainly we get on to thinking about the wounds that officers could get, and also the diseases that they could experience as well. Could be difficult things to observe, particularly in a loved one. And so there probably were, we know less about that because they weren't documenting them in medical ways. They were documenting them as part of personal stories, about their role as a woman and about their role as a wife. So some of the experiences are going to be hidden from us that they went through. And of course, the biggest one would have been actually them losing their husband, their husband being killed, and what that did to them. And in those, sometimes the only stories we get are them petitioning someone like the War Office or the Commander-in-Chief as a widow about, here's the service of my husband, I was with them at these times, can I get a pension? And sometimes we get the stories from them about just how involved they were in military lives.
Kevin, I just want to stick with the sort of women's stories and the wives for a second, and almost circle back to one of our earlier questions. We talked about the divide between officers in the rank and file. Now, obviously, wives are regulated, but significantly less so in terms of their behaviour. Do you think, and this may just be an opinion if you don't have evidence for it, but do you think that we would see a much narrower divide, or a much closer social structure between wives of the rank and file and wives of the officers, or do you think perhaps that divide would still be maintained?
Mm. I don't think we have the evidence, or if there is, it's kind of, someone needs to go and find it, which it may be out there. My suspicion would be that the divide would be maintained. And where officers' wives were, you know, relating to, having, in kind of communication or kind of working with, if you like, other ranks wives and other ranks men, it would probably conform to certain expectations about female behavior as a middle or upper class woman. So so they may be able to help out, but it would be a form of charity rather than kind of sort of, oh, I'm mucking in because, we're all kind of wives of soldiers sort of thing. That will be my kind of suspicion rather than kind of, any evidence-based kind of, historical analysis of it. But I'd be surprised if it was any different from, the way that women of a certain class behaved towards enlisted men or the kind of rank and file in the army in more general terms.
Okay, well, I'm gonna morph myself into my colleague Dr. Zach White with this question, which might throw you slightly, but we'd never be able to get through anything.
We're going to talk
Any
about punishment, aren't we?
you know him so well. We can the way that Zach can shoehorn crime and punishment into anything is quite frankly I mean, not shocking. It's admirable.
It's a skill, first of
Taking
all.
it to
It's
an
an
art
art.
form, yeah.
Yeah, it is an art form. But also it's highly bloody relevant,
Yeah, it
man.
is.
Like, come on.
It is. It is. I absolutely jest. We could be talking about how to do the dishes, and we'd end up talking about crime and punishment, Zach.
Don't start
Um,
giving me ideas.
so we're talking about the officers here, and I want to talk about how officers were reprimanded, and
Mm,
indeed what were the most common transgressions. We know rank and file who were sentenced to floggings and sometimes extremely harsh. But what sort of things are we looking at here for those with commissioned rank?
yeah, they are very different, radically different, I think. So there's no corporal punishment for officers, and where punishments focused was about honor, basically, and sort of social standing. So it would be kind of public reprimands. It would be at worst cases, in the most severe cases, I suppose, very public dismissals with kind of, noting that they've been dishonored, as part of this. And one of those being that they are getting cashiered. So they're kind of basically thrown out of the service and aren't allowed to kind of get any kind of financial benefits if they had them before through purchase or anything like that. There's some other, and Zach knows much more about this than I do, about sort of the quiet behind the scenes kind of monitoring and control of behavior. So officers, for whatever reason, and we'll come on to those a little bit in a moment, choosing to leave the service, or it looks like they're choosing to leave the service, but basically they've been forced out. They've been asked to leave. Or kind of perhaps slightly less, severe would be that they're moved to kind of different roles, either sometimes a different unit, or sometimes it could be a different part of the same unit, particularly if they're in the infantry regiments and there's two battalions. And one battalion might be kind of doing the active service, and one might be at home kind of doing the recruiting and the admin. And sort of officers are silently moved from one more active scene to the sort of the admin, if you like, side, and the recruiting and the training, and that's kind of the way that this is dealt with. So there's kind of a lot of that going on, which links a bit, I suppose, to what we were talking about right at the start about sort of how people move through the regimental system, how they get promoted. Sometimes people are sort of shunted sideways or outwards to remove them from the army. What the kind of causes were, or why they would be kind of subject to these punishments. Some of them were kind of very specific about kind of breaking regulations, particularly kind of financial ones. Those are the ones where kind of some people get caught out, basically because they're corrupt and they're fleecing their own pockets, and it's okay, we're not having this. Another big one would be actually just not turning up as an officer, and being kind of persistently absent from a unit, or in some cases actually I can't remember the name, but finding a few that were obviously playing the system and were telling each of the different parts of the units that they were serving with the other one. There's kind of how long do they get away with it for until they get found out. Someone actually puts these two pieces of paper together and realizes you're not at either one. So absenteeism being one where after a certain point, particularly the Duke of York and the Horse Guards would, routinely start going through those lists, and officers who were absent without leave, or absent, overextended the leave that they'd have, had a warning, if you like, that they need to rejoin their regiment, and they didn't, could then find themselves in worst cases, moved out of the army. Or superseded, which was the other one, which just kind of means they're not going to get promoted. So they lose the opportunity to be, everyone else is promoted before they are. Then you get to the kind of, and say Zach could talk more about this, probably much more than I can. There's much more nebulous charges about sort of ungentlemanly behaviour and certain expectations about how officers are meant to behave in units and breaking those, which can range from really, really quite serious disagreements, and some cases probably actually a diplomatic way of covering some aspects of cowardice amongst the officer corps, to some people just saying something that someone else didn't like, or they just didn't get on with each other. And the way they played out this personal disagreement was through the court-martial system. They couldn't seem to sort of resolve it or find a way of resolve it in a gentlemanly way. And that was the sort of key to it. I think some of those charges were expectations about behaviour that went beyond just what was expected in the army, but how they thought they should be treated as officers. That sometimes throws up some really complicated questions about the officer corps, because sort of gentlemanly status was meant to be, in a weird kind of way, quite equal. It didn't quite matter what rank you were or kind of how much money. If you met a sort of certain standard, you could expect an equality of behaviour amongst all other gentlemen. But that rubs up very badly in the army, where you have people who are very clearly of a higher rank than you and can order you about. Because the majors can command captains and captains. So there was this kind of hierarchy within that, which meant, some officers could feel aggrieved about the way a commanding officer talked to them, and the other way around as well, that some commanding officers could feel that their junior officers were giving them a bit too much back chat, and would say this is not the behaviour I expect as an officer. So within that, there's a whole sort of really complicated set of why officers could end up being punished, but in also very different ways, as I highlighted earlier. Some of them, this would go all the way through the court-martial system. Others, it would be dealt with very quietly. And all the sort of evidence we have might be sometimes letters which talk about individual cases, that someone's just basically giving us a bit of gossip, or an officer just sort of moves out for no particular reason of a regiment and sort of disappears from the sort of view of that corps.
Just to hurl some stats at this, because it provides an interesting conduct. So the top 12 types of charge: behavior or conduct unbecoming or an equivalent, that accounts for nearly 24% of trials in 11 years, 1808 to 1818. Disrespectful, insulting, abusive language or use of inappropriate language, that's 18%. So again, kind of failure to meet standards of behavior. Disobedience, mutiny, mutinous conduct, that interestingly is nearly 14%. So quite a lot higher than you might necessarily expect. Failure to fulfill or neglect of duty, that's 12%. Dueling and equivalent charges like sending a challenge, being a second in a duel, that's 9.3%. Making false or spurious allegations or assertions about another officer's actions or character, so trying to undermine the system from within, that's 9%. Quite often you find lieutenants getting overly kind of bolshy and being responsible for that. Drunkenness, either on or off duty, 7.6. Desertion, absence from post or absent without leave, 7.1. Misapplying of money or stores, fraudulent actions and embezzlement, 6.6. Murder, killing, and equivalent charges of an unlawful nature, 2.3. Oppression of lower ranks, that's 1.4%. And theft is 0.5%, just 5 cases out of however many I looked at over that time span. So that gives you an idea of where the army is choosing to focus. And the thing I always say is that just because something makes its way to trial
Mm.
does not mean that is the most prevalent crime. It's just the one that the army will refuse to tolerate and will make the biggest example of. And I think this says a lot about this argument that I'm increasingly developing, that military law is, I mean, we've got to think of it kind of as employment law, but with the stakes
Mm.
turned up to
Yeah,
27, because like you can be shot
yeah.
if you really screw this up.
Mm.
So there's a lot kind of going on there in terms of failure to fulfill
Mm.
standards fundamentally. Um,
Mm.
and then sort of additional things of like, you know, murder, like we are going to prosecute you
Yeah.
for that kind of thing. You can't just get away with it because you're an officer. But yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize the honor element. There's a phase where the courts martial are sort of seen as a kind of a court of honor, i.e., a place where you can go to have your honor rehabilitated,
Mm.
because you take this case to court and go, you know, person X is aspersing my character, and you know, that leads to kind of an abuse of the system, because
Mm.
people kind of want these court martials as a way of clearing their names
Mm.
in regards to their honorable character, as
Mm.
opposed to what they're actually there to do, which is to sort of police the behavior that really matters in the army rather than person X insulted you.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating the kind of that intersection between their attitudes as kind of as officers, as gentlemen, and what the army expected, and that court martial system and how it gets used. And I think you've probably found them. I've you know certainly seen a few where you kind of, it almost feels like legal cases where you get two cases running side by side, where one officer's accused an officer of the other one, and the other officer then decides to do like a counterclaim against the officer that's made the original complaint, and they're sort of running in parallel. Yeah, in like just there's a legal dispute. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a sort of defamation element,
Mm.
isn't there? And sort of, well, you know, if you're going to bring a case against me, well, I'm going to really turn this up to 11. And it's the pettiness and the childishness that always gets me. One of the first cases that I ever opened up actually had a challenge
Mm.
contained in it as part of the evidence packet.
Wow.
And it was, I kid you not, it was, you know, we sort of talk about people being dumb writing in wax crayon. It was, obviously it's written in ink, but this guy had sort of scrawled, "You are a blackguard," over it, and had sort of taken his finger and just kind of smudged this line across the bottom to underline blackguard, and it was written in what was clearly meant to be either an indication of he couldn't write,
Yeah.
or more likely trying to disguise his handwriting. You just sort of think, just get a grip, mate. Like maybe stop, sober up, and
Yeah.
then
Well,
think if you want to send that
there's
letter.
always that element behind it, isn't it? It's just how much have they been drinking before this happened? Yeah. Sometimes it does feel like a bit of a Friday night out, doesn't it? When things get a bit messy and yeah.
It absolutely does. Yeah, so it's not just kind of texting that leads to sort of spur of the moment communication. This is an issue from across history. Let's talk about getting out of the army.
Mm.
In a sort of you've been kicked out and cashiered and you've lost all the value of your commission. And I suppose that's the point to kind of emphasize in terms of those different punishment systems, right? Like one is all about the investment that you have made personally, and the other is about, well, you volunteered to sign up and we pay you and we don't pay you enough, so we can't really institute kind of well, they do institute financial constraints on the rank and file, but it doesn't work in the same way.
Yeah.
But if you choose to get out,
Mm.
like you want your money back. You didn't just buy the rank because you're incredibly patriotic and you want to donate your
Yeah.
donate your finances and your fortunes to the running of the British Army.
Mm.
But that isn't necessarily an easy process. So
Mm.
talk me through, I guess, how you get the permission to go, because you
Yeah.
can't just go, "I've had enough of this," and you know,
Well,
bye. There's no mic drop moment. Um,
I think some
and
try to do that and
well, yes, but it doesn't.
it doesn't work.
I mean, that's how you end up being charged for being absent without leave or desertion, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, but equally, that process of trying to sell a commission, that doesn't strike me as being simple. So how is that done?
Mm. Well, first of all, there's kind of two different ways that officers could leave, because not everyone sold their commissions to leave. Some could just resign and leave the army. they did need permission to do that. They had to get permission from the commander-in-chief to do that. So if an officer hadn't purchased any commissions, they've actually got an easier way of getting out of the army if they want to, or if they could write off, the money that they invested. So if they're sometimes quite a junior rank and it's kind of, well, okay, I do have a lot of money and I've invested a few £100 in my N90, but I've had enough of this, they can go. And I think the commander-in-chief is usually fairly responsive to those requests, unless there was some very specific military need that actually, this unit will not have a major if you go, sort of things. Yeah. So there's this very specific kind of terminology that's being used. So about resignations and officers being able to do that. Then there is the retire, and this is where the interesting sort of language comes in, because the whole point of one of the points of the purchase system was that originally it was intended that meant the army didn't have to run a pension system for officers, but officers would sell their commission, get this money, and that would fund their pension. Basically, that becomes their retirement fund. It literally is. That's why it's called retirement. But as you say, that means they've got to find a buyer. And that's not always straightforward. And in some units, that might be a little bit easier, that there is a kind of more of a tradition, if you like, of purchase, which meant that the person making the next step doesn't have to then spend quite as much, because they're selling it's the housing chain analogy sort of thing. They're selling their commission to then go up and, helps fund their next one. But for other officers, jumping straight in, that could be quite a challenge. How they actually, found a buyer is tricky. The regulations were that they had to offer it to anyone in the regiment first, to see whether anyone wanted to buy it. And if that didn't happen, it could go onto sort of an open market to the rest of the army. But, how do they find those people to buy it? There were a kind of slightly shady, slightly nebulous set of brokers in London that were well informed about who was selling and who was willing to buy. The army was meant to also keep a list of officers that were wanting to purchase as well. So actually the military secretary had a list of people who've given an expression that they were prepared to buy a next rank. So there is a kind of matchmaking service going on, being offered there. So that allowed, I think most probably to retire in the end, though maybe not always at the time that they wanted to. The sort of third, well, actually there's two other options. The third, and probably the bigger probably than retirement, is actually officers going on half pay. So they are kind of leaving the active part of the army, if you like, but are then going on to almost basically a kind of like a reserve list. So they're not actually serving with the army. They get some money. It's not actually half their pay. It's less than that. And they're on a kind of retainer, basically, to come back to the army. In 1811? I think it was 1811. Legislation was changed to actually allow officers to choose to move to the half pay or the horse guards, to actually almost force officers onto the half pay lists, whilst previously it had to be either a regiment was reduced, so it sort of was shrunk, and then the remaining officers were sort of shed and put on half pay, or you'd have to swap with someone. So again, it was a bit like the sort of retirement fund. It's kind of, if you could find someone who was on half pay who wanted to go back to active service and you wanted to swap with them, you could make that arrangement. So that the numbers of half pay was really highly regulated before this change in 1811, I think. But after that, it does become an almost another form of retirement. It doesn't cost the government quite so much, but they're prepared to let officers move on to that, after long service, or they've become injured. And that does massively expand the half pay lists, understandably. But more importantly, probably for the army, it allows a better flow of officers through the ranks. Because previously, some of these officers would just stay in their positions until they could sell their commission. or were given permission to resign. So you could have a group of officers within the army that were just kind of clinging on to their post because they needed it for financial security. A smaller group of officers, probably quite small, were allowed to retire on full pay. And again, that was changed sort of during the Napoleonic Wars. Sort of very deserving, long-serving officers were actually allowed to move out of the army and get full pay. And there were veteran battalions too, and the officers for those were often long-serving officers that have, for whatever reason, being seen as very deserving and were allowed to move into these, basically garrison units and not have to do that much, keep full pay and stay in them for, as long as they can. Related to those, a very much smaller group of kind of officers were some postings which were basically sinecures. He required no active service. It was lieutenant governor of such and such a kind of castle, which actually really isn't a castle somewhere in Cornwall, and they take the pay of it, and it becomes a kind of reward for some officers. But again, a way of moving some of these officers into these positions that frees up a space for someone else to move into them. So lots of ways of leaving, and then some are kind of sort of leaving the active part of the army. There's a sort of this other community of officers around them that are on half pay or in garrison units or in these other kind of positions that the army has that it can offer to certain officers as a way of moving people on from the active part.
Looking at that, I suppose it links to my next question, Kevin. And I suppose it depends on the manner, firstly, in the manner in which they leave the active list, and their sort of their transition out of the army. But generally speaking, how much kudos would a military career bring? And again, I suppose that there's many variables in terms of their rank on leaving and their service history, the regiment they served with. But once a man's returned to civilian life, how much credit does he get for that service? And do we know much about these men's lives beyond the army?
We know a bit about some of them. I think there's some interesting sort of stratification of officers, but depending on how they left as well. So those that retire and sell their commission, the kind of slate is wiped clean, if you like. That's it for their kind of association with the army. So if they were a lieutenant and they retired from the army, they couldn't then keep calling themselves a lieutenant. They had sold their commission. That was kind of it, really. Those that become, half pay officers and these sorts of other roles actually keep that sort of social status as an officer. But as they get higher up the ranks, so those officers who get army rank, brevet rank, and then leave, get to keep that kind of, that position, that prestige, if you like. So the long list of officers that starts with the army list of everyone that's above a major includes a lot of people who have left the army. So if anyone's ever looked at some of the lists of the British Army and think, why does the army have so many major generals and so many lieutenant colonels and majors? And it's kind of, well, yeah, most of them actually probably aren't actually serving with the army. Those are former officers who've kept their titles. They're allowed to stay on that kind of list because they've got army rank. But I think, for those ones, I think it was, and I think this was drove a lot of sort of behavior in the army in terms of promotion. Getting to that level was really important, I think, for officers, and I think seen outside the army as quite significant. Being able to say that you had become a major in the army meant a certain social status. It gave you a certain social cachet outside of the army. And that obviously that increases the higher up you go. For some officers, though, of course, they didn't get to that kind of point, the kind of junior officers. And it's an interesting one about how much they would have leaned on their military careers afterwards, that they were a captain for 10 years and now they're not, or whether it was just that was part of their experience in their gentlemanly lives, if you like. And I think that it's going to be very varied depending on the officer or where they were and, how secure they felt in their sort of social status. But what they go on to, for some, the army was very much just part of sort of social advancement, and kind of they went into the army very explicitly to gain that kind of status and come out as quickly as possible. There were others, I think, where the military service was, a big part of their lives and was, important. They saw it as a duty, and then probably kept very much their sort of military identity afterwards. Sometimes they could be the people that then go on to have other roles in the state and local government. Afterwards, kind of sort of the JPs, the administrators, the kind of, I suspect some of them probably went into the police as that kind of, starts being formed in the mid 19th century as well. So, and certainly in colonial government, you see kind of former officers turning up as well. So there is kind of a group who move into these other roles of, in administration, in government, in politics, perhaps politics a little bit less. Well, politics in terms of running things. Whether that was because of their military service or how much they mentioned it is a tricky one. I think probably more in the colonial kind of imperial administration, service in the armed forces would be seen as a positive thing. And certainly there'd be networks, I think, of people in those kind of parts of government who would know each other from previous, lives in the armed forces or know of them through other contacts. I think particularly Australia, I think, was one where there's a very strong kind of sort of military tradition infused into the administration of that colony. For others, though, I suppose we kind of don't know. This part of the project of getting a long list of all the officers that ever were is to then, well, actually, what does happen to these people? Particularly those that may have, served for a relatively short time. How does this fit in with the rest of their lives? And what do they go on to do? So there's a lot more to do with those. And the ones that we do know about, it's the ones that wrote about themselves. We published the diaries and the journals and these sorts of things, and they're not a great representative group, I think.
That's a rather beautiful segue on many levels. The one that always springs to my mind in relation to a number of themes you were raising there is a guy called John Mee in Southampton, whose grave I've cleaned. I mean, it's in pieces. It was hit by an incendiary bomb during the Second World War, and it's always struck me as weird that there is an inconsistency because his gravestone declares him to be Captain John Mee. When you look at the army list, he's in a Royal Veteran Battalion, 5th Royal Veteran, I think. He's never listed above the rank of lieutenant. So clearly he clung to that army association based on what you're saying here. But equally, it does rather smack of him also having embellished that association. And he might have been a lieutenant in the army lists, but everybody referred to him quite clearly as the captain. And he did what you're kind of saying there. He went on to be a JP. It's a bit of a head scratcher, actually, why he ends up in Southampton, because he spends most of his career out in Ireland after the war. But it's just kind of an example of how some of these guys just don't let go. And that just solitary example really ties together some of the themes that you're raising there. You preempted my final question, which was with regards to legacies. The immediate kind of point to think about is, of course, the memoirs, because we've got plenty of them, especially from the 95th. Thank you, Kincaid.
We haven't mentioned them yet too much, have we? So,
no, we haven't. That's because if we do, I might develop a nervous twitch. Right. Although I did consider doing just biting the bullet and doing an entire episode on the 95th Rifles just for the Sharp fan club. So if you are desperate not to hear one of those, let us know. But I do want to think about the legacy of these guys. So I suppose one way of kind of looking at this memoir question is, if we didn't have so many, or if we had a better balance, how different do you think it would be in terms of not only a wider distribution of units, but also a better distribution in terms of rank and file versus officer memoirs? But also, what are the other legacies that these guys leave in the wake of the conflict?
Yeah, on the kind of legacy memoirs and better balance, yeah, it is kind of very heavily skewed towards, yeah, certainly the 95th, then the kind of Peninsular War, then kind of officers, and sort of trailing behind that become, well, the rank and file, and then rank and file who served anywhere else, not in Spain and Portugal, are incredibly rare. So I think in terms of, yeah, what would a better balance look like, even if it was just on the officers, we would expect to see much more kind of global stories, about those officers who are in South Africa for a long time, or South Asia, or North America. What were their experiences, particularly like some of them in South Asia when they invaded places like Java, all these other campaigns, or the campaign that went up the Gulf, the Persian Gulf for a very short while. Not huge numbers, but in terms of sort of where's sort of the balance, and where would we expect to see more? Certainly the Caribbean. That's the other kind of big area, I think. And also kind of there's a question about the ranks that we see as well. It is the ones that kind of made it, if you like, we tend to know about. So those that get to field rank. So yeah, we're missing, if you like, the stories. Not that there aren't any, but we would expect more of the junior ranks, the ensigns and the lieutenants, I think. And perhaps the interesting ones, and they're never going to write kind of diaries and journals about it, were those that weren't in the army for that long. And kind of, what was it that meant that after a year or two they left? And sometimes even shorter than that. I mean, we covered some of that. That might have been they were forced out, but there might be others that were actually it was fine for a few years, but actually some other thing happened in their life that meant that army career was not what they wanted to do anymore. The bigger legacies. I mean, I suppose one interesting one that I like digging into is beyond the memoirs, is actually just how much other material there is in archives from them. These letters, homes, and things. The stuff that particularly Severine Onges is working on is kind of, there are a lot of material from officers that isn't published, which is kind of has lots of stories that we still haven't fully explored, and some of the material that we talked about earlier. So those sketchbooks of their experiences of the war, they are there. Some of them, they are out there in the archives, and that probably relates to the other thing, which is probably a bit more visible to most of us, who go looking, and that's the material culture of officers and what's in museums. And what gets put on display in museums about this period, so there are the swords, there are the medals in particular, there are the kind of the jackets sometimes and the clothing that they wore. And going alongside that, quite a lot of them liked having themselves painted. So there's all these kind of other bits and pieces, which is, we can actually see what some of them look like, which is really fascinating. Obviously, it's kind of, there's artists involved in these sorts of things, and, we don't know, this is not a photograph, but we can put some names to faces. And sometimes we've got quite a lot of material, which we haven't done that with yet, which we could do a bit more with, I think. So I'm going to do a bit of kind of, self-promotion here. And that's kind of one of the unintended, or maybe not unintended, side kind of projects of doing all this work with the database with British Army officers, is actually, if you've got something about an officer where you've just got a name, you can then try and find out, well, actually, who is this now? Okay, which of these people with this name might this be, that we can start linking up, because there are some other clues in this artifact about perhaps what unit they were in or when they served, that we can start narrowing it down to, actually, this belonged to this person. And that is extremely difficult to do without kind of any sort of database. It means trawling through lots and lots of PDFs, which you can't search. So now we've got some things that could be tools to open up a few more of those stories. And even the other way around, where you have an artifact that comes from a unit, or particularly anonymous painting, but you can tell what rank they are, roughly what date it is. That will be very difficult to do beforehand to understand. So I think there's another legacy out there. And there's obviously the work that you've done, Zach. There is the kind of, the funereal kind of artifacts, the gravestones and the memorials to all these officers, which are, scattered across Britain and Ireland, which are there as kind of testament to all these people and what they did. And probably, you probably know better than us, some of those are some of the silent stories that we don't know about. This is all we have about them in terms of what their experience was and what they did and where they went. There may be a little biography there that actually would be very, very difficult to get hold of otherwise.
Yeah, one of the most common things is if they're at a battle, boy, do they love to brag about it.
Well, you would, wouldn't you? Yeah.
You would, in fairness, but like there's this very clear sense of
I
pay
was
more attention to me because I was at, and it's not necessarily Waterloo. Obviously, Waterloo's the one I suspect that
they all
really
want
kind
to,
of
wouldn't
that
they?
they all want to be able to say Waterloo on that final headstone. But you get, particularly in Brompton, you get there's a medic who does some time in Egypt, and I think he's at Toulouse, and like those are emblazoned on the sides of his memorials, and he's picked a spot where he's actually choosing to be buried near. It's almost like a kind of senior officers row, right in the center of Brompton Cemetery, where like clearly they all wanted to be near one another. Somebody clearly picked a spot first, and they all went, "Yes, I'm having
Yeah, yeah.
that one."
Mm.
So yeah, there is that legacy. If people choose to go looking for them, but as you say, now having a database makes life so much simpler because I can just pull that up and go, do I need to assess that one? No, that person is not an officer from my period, so therefore I can move on.
Kevin, thank you so much. I'm really pleased, I think, with that, and I'm glad we managed to wrap up officers in 2 episodes.
And only 2 episodes, yeah.
Yeah, only two. So our listeners, please go to the British Army Officers database at georgianarmyofficers.org. I'll put a link in the show notes, and also check out Kevin's work on the British Army and Britain and Wellington's Army. All links will be in the show notes. And you can look forward to hearing Kevin again soon, where we will start the deep dive into the rank and file. Thank you very much, Kevin. This has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast, and we'll be back very soon.
What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your questions and comments, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schrager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, Daniel Friedman, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.